Welcome to Therapist Confidential, a psychotherapy.net podcast. And now, here's your host, Travis Heath.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the Therapist Confidential podcast. I'm your host, Travis Heath. And today we're going to talk about things therapists might think, but don't necessarily say out loud. Therapy is often imagined as a space of, let's say, clarity, expertise, certainty, and perhaps a lot of that's projected onto therapy because, people show up to therapy often really struggling, sometimes in the worst place they've ever been in their life. So it's thought of as a space of certainty, clarity, where there's much expertise. And that's not to say that there isn't any of that. The truth is, a lot of therapy happens silently inside of the therapist. And today we're going to try to explore what some of that conversation might be inside of the therapist. Today's episode isn't so much about confessing to the world these secret sinful things we as therapists think about or something like that, although there may be some confession. And it isn't about grievance either. Right? It's more to explore some of the private decisions that therapists are making every session. And these decisions, easy for me to say, often shape the work, but aren't necessarily named. And these thoughts themselves aren't unethical. I think that we don't talk about some of what I'm going to bring up because we're afraid we'll be judged as unethical. And of course, we're human. Now, what we do with those thoughts, judgments, etc., that more determines what's ethical or not so ethical, right? But the thoughts themselves aren't unethical, they're human. And they're often unspoken because they can disrupt how therapy is often thought of or how it, quote unquote, should be understood. So therapy, I would say, doesn't work because therapists are free of these kind of thoughts we're going to talk about today, but it works because we're conscious of them as much as we can be and we hold them carefully. All right, so the first one I'll bring up is judgment. This idea that therapy is a judgment-free zone. This, of course, is not true. Any zone with human beings in it has judgment. I mean, judgment is part of how we make sense of the world. It's how our brains pick up on patterns. So the idea that somehow therapists could be free from judgment, I actually think is a dangerous one. Now, what we do with that judgment, and sometimes, noticing the judgments that are coming up for us as therapists, trying to make sense often in real time, which is tricky when we're in a conversation with someone, but trying to make sense of where those judgments might be coming from. And does it make sense to share those judgments? Often the answer is no. And then how do we make sense of them in our own mind? So this is happening all the time for therapists. It's not that it's a judgment-free zone. I would say at its best, therapy is a conscientious judgment zone, right? One where we're real thoughtful, hopefully, about what judgments are coming up and why. And then as therapists, we're able to recognize how our own judgments are often wrong. That's one of my favorite parts of being a therapist, actually. It wasn't when I first started, but it is now, is when some initial judgment or opinion I have is dead wrong and it takes a turn in another direction, right? But something that we will rarely say out loud as therapists is that we do have judgments that run through our head. In every session, if we're being honest, we have those. Hopefully, when we're in training, this is something we can talk about with supervisors. I found that's often not a space, unfortunately, where these are talked about. It seems like what we often do is we pretend that we don't have them, right? Because we don't want to be seen as a bad person or the bad clinician or whatever it is. And I would invite us to consider that being aware of those judgments and actually speaking about them can be useful. Okay, here's another one. Sometimes we as therapists can help you feel better. We're choosing not to. That could sound really bad, like, oh, I could help you feel better and I'm choosing not to. And I think kind of the ethic I'm getting at here is that relief isn't always the same as care. So there are moments when we as therapists know exactly, or at least we think we know exactly how to reduce stress or distress for a person that we're working with. And in fact, early in my career, that's what I thought we were supposed to be doing, to be honest with you. I thought we were supposed to be identifying what was uncomfortable and helping people feel better. And we were the ones who were supposed to do that, and we would come riding in on the noble steed to save the day. But even when we think, and we might be right sometimes, we know how to reduce stress, it may not be in our best interest to do so. Sometimes relief from this kind of stress can almost function as a sort of anesthesia, right? It's numbing people to what's going on. Another way of thinking about this is that kind of comfort that can come from relief of distress can sometimes interrupt a contact with a feeling, an experience, a story, a memory that could be essential to the person we're working with. But sometimes, the idea is we want to move so quickly to getting rid of distress. I want to propose that sometimes feeling better too quickly can almost allow avoidance to continue. Now, there's no doubt this creates an ethical tension, doesn't it? Am I caring for you? Am I protecting you from discomfort that actually matters in your life? Right? If I have a way that I think could help you feel better, boy, that deserves some unpacking. Feel better. What does that even mean? But if I think that I have something that could help you do that and I withhold it, am I now not caring for you? Am I enabling harm? I have clients, and some of them have worked with me for a minute, and it's almost become kind of a joke, where they'll say, well, I'm going to wait for you to tell me what to do now, right? And they know that I'm not going to tell them what to do. Mostly because usually I don't know what to do. I'm in a process together with them. So to be honest with you, it's not like most of the time I'm withholding. I have this great grand solution and I'm just withholding it so they can go through their process. Most of the time I don't know what the hell to do, to be honest. But even in the times that I might see some ideas that can help relieve that distress, I would rather ask questions and be present with the person in such a way that they arrive at that place themselves. And something that I've learned, even in the work I do, as a narrative therapist, which, narrative therapy has gotten, and I don't know, am I a narrative therapist? Depends on who you ask, I guess. But it's gotten storied as sort of a positive therapy, which I hate, and I don't think represents narrative therapy at all as this positive therapy. I think therapy often requires us to tolerate pain longer than most of us want to. And that's for the people that are positioned as quote unquote clients, and for us as therapists. And I'm not saying that's because suffering is necessarily virtuous in itself, but it becomes part of that process. Short-circuiting pain in some ways can then short-circuit the meaning and the process that comes of it. So if therapy immediately makes you feel better, it may be protecting you from something you actually need to face. Now, not always. Look, sometimes therapy works quick. It does. I mean, at our clinic at SDSU in the past, we've had like one session therapy that we offered at the clinic. Now, there's all sorts of reasons why. It's not saying that everyone can be served adequately in one session, but a lot can happen in one session. So I don't want to make it sound like therapy is always this slog. But I do think sometimes, we do have ideas as therapists about what could help people feel better. And we choose to withhold those to allow someone to go through a process. Okay, here's another one. Sometimes as therapists, we know the stories that are being told to us aren't exactly true. And I don't necessarily think that's problematic. And I'll tell you why. Now, first of all, truth, I mean, gosh, we could wax philosophical about truth, for the next 10 podcasts. What is truth? And, philosophers far more intelligent than I'll ever be have tried to tackle that topic. But I think it's probably safe to say that in many instances, what we call truth is not binary. Truth is largely subjective. There are exceptions, of course, to that. But dealing with the kinds of truths we deal with in therapy, often what is referenced as truth is more someone's subjective experience and frame of reference, right? And so the truth is that sometimes people tell stories and we know they may not be quote unquote true or all the way true. Hopefully, if you're doing this job, you learn how to listen closely and you'll hear inconsistencies in stories sometimes. You'll hear stories that might feel rehearsed and have just been repeated over and over. Sometimes there are omissions in stories that are accidental, sometimes not so accidental. And sometimes we don't challenge these. Now, listen, there are times to challenge these things. But I don't think the question is always, is this true? At least to me, that's not the most interesting question. Is this true? The more interesting question to me is, what is this story doing for you in your life? How is it helping you make sense of the world and your identity? Now, if a story, if a story is rooted in so many untruths that someone can't keep it straight, I mean, that's different. That's not the kind of inconsistency that, at least for me as a therapist in 20 plus years of doing this, that I often see. It's often much more subtle. And so then when things are omitted or the truth isn't totally told, why is that happening? It could be for protection, self-preservation. It could be a way of staying attached to something, a way of distancing from something. It could be a way of staying intact in a really difficult time. And, sometimes I hear people talk about therapy as this truth-telling zone, where the therapist is the truth teller. The therapist is the truth teller, It's like, yeah, look at the badass therapist who tells the truth. That sounds good. I mean, it can sound good depending on what the identity of the therapist or the preferred identity of the therapist is, how they want to be viewed. But sometimes forcing honesty too early can actually destabilize people. It can destabilize people's identities. It can humiliate people. It can rupture safety that's happening. And so just the idea of, well, just tell the truth all the time, right? Just be a blatant truth teller all the time, I think ignores the process of therapy. And again, going back to this question of trying to understand the story. What is the story doing for you? How is it helping you make sense of things in the world, right? How's it functioning? That's a much more interesting question than is it true? Now, of course, there are some times where there are inconsistencies, and we might challenge those inconsistencies. That's certainly something I do sometimes as a therapist, right? But it's not something I just do automatically all the time. Because, I think we've all heard sometimes people in the world, where they'll say something like, I'm just being real, man. I'm just being real. Yeah, but that's more about you than it is the person that you're speaking with. Because part of our job, I think, as therapists, yes, it's to have honest conversations to the best of our ability to do so, but in ways that the other party can receive that honesty. Because if it's more about us wanting to look like this rugged truth teller, well, that might not serve the other person so well. So yes, it's about honesty, but in a way that's survivable for the person that we're in conversation with. So yes, sometimes we do know that parts of stories aren't true, and that isn't always the most important focus. All right, let's look at a couple more. So things that we therapists might think, but we rarely say out loud. We think, I can't help you. Boy, this is something I think routinely every week. I can't help you. Now, Again, do I say that out loud? No. Well, usually not. I mean, maybe there's been times I've said that, or I probably wouldn't say it that way. I'd probably say, gosh, I'm not sure if I can help you. But we often think that we can't help people. What's interesting is we're still here anyways. Now, of course, yes, there are elements of competency where we would need to refer people out. I mean, of course, right? But I'm talking about you're working with someone that you have competency to be working with, and you think, I can't help this person. And I think therapy does have limits that it often is reluctant to name. Might be bad for the business model. You know, there are moments, sometimes early on, sometimes not, sometimes slowly, sometimes more quickly, when a therapist senses that this may not be helping you, and it may not be helping you in the way that therapy promises. I mean, I try to establish my own idea of what therapy is with people when we start, and maybe that's a little different than how therapy is thought of in pop culture and, you know, popular discourse. But sometimes we're working with people and we get the sense this may not help them in the way that therapy promises. And it's not because the client is, you know, resistant or even because the therapist is unskilled or doesn't have enough experience. It's sometimes because the limits are real, right? Of course, as therapists, sometimes we are less skilled. We have less experience. Although if you've listened to the podcast with Dr. Daryl Chow, I mean, he talks about how, you know, experience is often conflated with effectiveness. Some really interesting ideas and research around that, right? But sometimes the limits are very real. And when I say limits, what do I mean? So, you know, for example, like a structural limit. Somebody's working multiple jobs, caring for a family. They're in survival mode all the time. You know, therapy can't remove poverty, racism, migration precarity as is happening in the United States now, housing instability. So sometimes the problem isn't about insight. It is about material reality of people's lives. You know, there's relational limits. So sometimes people are embedded in relationships where leaving would mean exile, danger, profound loss. Therapy can maybe help name this and explore it, but it can't magically free people from it. There's psychic limits. By that I mean sort of limits of the psyche. You know, perhaps the story one is telling is holding together one's identity. And to pull it apart would leave one without coherence or any sort of stable ground. So in this case, insight wouldn't necessarily be liberating. It might be destabilizing and not look, sometimes therapy is destabilizing and that's important. It's part of the process, but I'm talking about destabilizing in a way that's too much. So whether it's structural, relational, psychic limits, also, you know, capacity limits. People's nervous systems are already overloaded. You know, more quote unquote work, more feeling, more truth, etc., whatever the therapy's supposed to be doing would overwhelm people rather than help them. And then, you know, sometimes it's about timing. Sometimes in therapy, what we're circling may only become livable later, after a loss, you know, aging, illness, other life events that therapy can't, you know, manufacture or maneuver pieces on the chessboard of life. You know, sometimes it's just timing. Sometimes things have to be gone through first, and there's nothing therapy can do to ultimately change that. So what can therapy do here? You know, if it's sometimes we think we can't help and we look at it and we're like, dang, there are all these very real limits. So what can therapy do? Since therapists probably aren't going to say, I can't help you. Maybe we should do that more, but we're probably not going to say that most of the time. Well, one thing we do is we stay. We stay in that relationship. And perhaps that requires us then to quietly recalibrate what, you know, helping means. So rather than fixing something, we're accompanying someone, right? Rather than, you know, changing something, we're providing some sort of stabilization. Rather than, you know, providing profound insight that changes someone's life, we're helping someone to survive. And rather than, finding some grand resolution for someone, we're helping people to maintain dignity in very difficult parts of their lives. So then there are moments when therapy continues on, even when we as therapists feel like it may not be helping, but it carries on because it's a helpful friend in navigating the impossible. It doesn't solve it. And perhaps then when we as therapists are saying, I think I can't help you, I wonder if what we're often feeling inside or saying to ourselves inside is, I think I can't solve it for you. I think I can't make you feel all the way better. And I know if you ask most therapists, they know the company line and they're, oh, that's not what I'm doing. Yeah, but I think a lot of therapists, that's what they want to be doing, right? That's one way or another what we've come to feel we have to be doing. And so maybe it's not that we can't help someone. Maybe it's just that we have to do that in a different way. And maybe there's something that's really dignifying in hanging in there with someone through the impossible. All right, what's something else that therapists think but rarely say out loud? And this one, I think, relates some to what we were just saying, the idea of I can't help. And then this can go a little bit further to, I can see that your life might not get better. Right? So first it's, I can't help, or I don't think I can help. I wonder if I can't help. And then as it goes along, maybe your life won't get better. Right? And again, for some of the same reasons we talked about before, family obligation, chronic illness, poverty, racism, et cetera, therapy can't remove these things. And in some ways, pretending that therapy can be cruel. So again, it's a shift, right? And maybe it's kind of a process where first we think maybe I can't help, and then we start to see, well, maybe your life actually isn't going to get better. And that's where we go from that, trying to help people grow and transform to helping them maintain dignity. Instead of trying to help people improve, we're helping them find meaning. And instead of, producing some grand hope, we're accompanying people. But this is tough because, again, therapy markets change. Therapy doesn't market presence. It markets change. That's what big therapy, if I can call it that, sells. But sometimes if therapy is promising a better life, it's not telling the truth, right? It's lying. I mean, that's a great tagline for a business. But sometimes therapy doesn't always promise a better life, but it might help offer a truer one for people. It might help offer a more dignified one for people. Right? All right, one more thing. I mean, there's so many of these. I hope as you're listening, you're thinking of some of these too. Maybe some of the conversations you've had internal dialogue with in your own sessions, or maybe, if you supervise, you may have had these conversations with supervisees. But therapists benefit from clients that stay just functional enough. This is an uncomfortable one. I'm going to warn you up front. So central to this idea is that therapy exists at least in culture, in our culture in the United States and in many cultures around the world, is situated in a late capitalist neoliberal framework. And therapy is a paid relationship. I remember in my first group supervision in my master's program, there was a supervisor. I don't remember how this came up. I wish I remember the context of what brought it up. But this idea of being like an emotional prostitute came up. It was a really fascinating idea. about what therapists were being paid to do and how that was looked upon versus how, sex work might be looked upon and how that was being judged. Now, 20 some years ago, may have even been a little bit different than how it would be judged now. But it was a fascinating way of looking at things and a reminder that therapy is a paid relationship. It's embedded in economic and social systems. So even when intentions are clean and clear, which I would hope that's often the case in therapy, it still can be true that therapists benefit from clients that are just functional enough. Because if clients, quote unquote, get all the way better, well, then you're out of business, right? If clients are acutely suffering, well, that's a lot of work, right? It might require work outside of just the 1 hour a week or 1 hour every couple weeks. And so what about someone who's just functional enough, right? There's this kind of unspoken equilibrium, distressed enough to keep coming, but stable enough to keep paying. Now, this is rarely conscious and this is uncomfortable. And I sure as hell am not sitting here telling you, oh, I'm the one who does this right. I don't deal with any of this tension. No, I think all of us deal with this tension. Certainly it exists if you're in private practice because it's a little bit different than if you're working in a hospital or community mental health setting where you have a salary or something like that, right? Or you're getting paid by the hour and not for each therapy session or whatever it is. So this is something that I think all of us have to reckon with. And it's rarely conscious. It's uncomfortable when it is. It's uncomfortable for me to be raising this and talking about it right now. It's structural. It's definitely structural. And in many ways, the mental health industry survives by managing suffering, not eliminating it. Now, this is often when, and I find myself doing the same thing, where we kind of exit the conversation because it's uncomfortable. And we go, well, this is the system we live in, so we do the best that we can, And we kind of exit it because it's really uncomfortable to think about this. Or we say, well, even if someone, I was using the phrase just functional enough, even if someone's still just functional enough, they could still benefit from therapy, right? We have a way of rationalizing all of this. But let's just be honest. If everyone healed fully and collectively, much of therapy as we know it would collapse. Now, given the society we live in and given just the history of human beings, I don't anticipate that ever happening, of course, but it's an interesting little thought experiment, right? And it reminds us that we continually have to be reckoning with the work we're trying to do and how it is interconnected within a neoliberal late capitalist system. And, people rationalize it really well. People talk about the frame and, the therapist doesn't need to get any psychological or emotional gratification out of any of it because the fee, that's what you get out of it is the fee. And we have really good ways of rationalizing why we should get paid, some people upwards of $300, $400, $500 an hour. We have great ways of rationalizing it. And, this also aligns with people's model. Well, all models should be short-term models, That's the ethical model because then people aren't paying a bunch. But then people will say, well, but those models don't create real change. So actually we should have long-term therapy. But the counter to that is, well, you're taking people's money. Well, yes, but we're not taking their money because we only work as long as there needs to be work. But there's years worth of work to do. So we have all of these different philosophies. And I'm not smart enough to tell you which one is right or wrong. Certainly people have their preferences. I don't think anyone really knows which one is right or wrong, just to be really honest with you. People have their preferences and their ideas and their rationalizations. But it's a difficult thing to confront, this idea that as therapists, we often benefit from people staying just functional enough. I don't have the answer to any of these, but just trying to get underneath the surface of some of these internal dialogues we as therapists have sometimes that are uncomfortable. So again, these thoughts aren't hidden because they're unethical. They're hidden because they disrupt the stories that therapy tells about itself. And of course, like most stories in life, I mean, the story about therapy, the story that the field wants therapy to be, they want it to be clean, hopeful, productive, almost innocent. But when we really look at the process of therapy and the cultures in which it's situated in, we see that it's ambiguous. It has many limits. There's power everywhere. There's power. There's grief. And so much more, right? So the story of therapy isn't clean. It's complicated. And therapy is an imperfect endeavor. It serves some people more than it serves other people. And certainly some therapists are better at it than other therapists. Let's just be honest about it. Not every therapist is equally skilled. Now, what exactly makes for a skilled therapist? Again, my friend Daryl Chow, listened to that episode. He has a lot of interesting things to say and has written a lot of interesting things about that topic, right? But therapy doesn't happen because thoughts like I've raised today are absent. It happens because someone's holding them. A therapist is holding them quietly, responsibly, and often alone. And I hope if you take anything from this episode today, it may be that you don't hold them alone. Start speaking with trusted colleagues about these. What are the uncomfortable thoughts that come into your mind about therapy? The thoughts you're not supposed to have, or the thoughts that you think could be harmful, or the thoughts that if somebody else knew you were having them in the field, you'd be judged really negatively. I think the more that we can confront these, the better, because we're all up against them. Some people are much better at rationalizing them than others, but we're all up against these. And we can hold them responsibly and we can do good and important work. But as much as we can, let's not hold these alone. All right, everyone. Thanks for being here again today. Hope the conversation was worthwhile. If it is, send it to a friend. Send it to a colleague, a classmate, a professor, a mom, a dad, a brother, a sister, whomever you think might like it, whether they're a therapist or not. Or even if they don't like it, might find it interesting, or, might want to be very critical of it and make sport of criticizing it. Whatever the reason is, if you think someone might meaningfully interact with it, please send it to them. And it helps us out if you give us a 5-star rating and all, or give us a 2-star rating if we suck. Listen, you should rate us as you see fit, but share it, rate it. If you enjoy it, let us know. We're having a lot of fun bringing these to you. And until next time.